Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK Spring Split 2024 Playoff Primer video. Man, am I excited to get into this. It is playoff season in the LCK. Finally, we've gotten there after a long regular season, one of the longest feeling ones, at least, in memory. We are finally here at the games that really matter. I think this season felt like it took so long because of the difference between the good teams and the bad teams. We knew the teams that were going to be making it into playoffs. We knew the teams that we were going to be talking about in today's video. We just had to wait a little bit to get to them, but now we finally have eliminated the bottom four, and we are down to only the top six, and so I'm excited to go over everything today. If you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. What are you most looking forward to when it comes to the playoffs? What series, what teams? Do you think anybody might over or underachieve expectations? Of course, we're going to be going over all of my opinions on that in this video, but if you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the LCK so far this year, in the Spring Split, we've done a weekly recap for every single week of the LCK. That's going to be linked in a playlist up in the iCard right now. You can check that out if you are interested, but this is going to be kind of an overview of the regular season and a preview of everything in the playoffs. If you are new to these primer videos, what we are going to do is first, of course, go over our award picks for the regular season. That's going to be the major awards and the minor ones. So MVP, I'm going to give out a Rookie of the Split, even though I know broadcast doesn't do that. I'll talk about why I understand why that decision was made once we get to that section, because there really aren't a lot of great options at the moment. But MVP, Rookie of the Split, as well as my 3 All-Pro teams. And so I'll be giving you guys my opinions on who I think is playing well going into the playoffs. And remember, this is an assessment of the entirety of the regular season. There are going to be some controversial picks. There almost always is. And then, of course, after that, we are going to be previewing every single team in the playoffs. We'll be talking about our top 2 seeds individually, and then talking about seeds 3 through 6 in the context of their first round matchups, because that's really what matters. If you can't win in round number 1, it doesn't matter how good of a team you are. Outside of that, you have to be able to take down your first opponent to stay alive and to make the double elimination part of the LCK bracket. And then, of course, our final slide will be a full bracket prediction here in the LCK. I'll be giving you guys my opinions on how I think every series will go, and ultimately who I think will be hoisting the LCK trophy at the end of spring, and the 2 teams that I believe will be representing Korea at MSI. So, excited to get into all of that. It's going to be a jam-packed video. I hope you guys are ready. Usually I don't ask for this at the beginning of these videos, but the primer ones are very big. They take a little while to make in terms of the graphics and just the decision making, and they're more opinion based. And so if you guys do find yourself liking it, I really would appreciate if you leave a like. I'm not going to ask you to do that now, but if in 5, 10, 30 minutes you find yourself being like, I'm really enjoying this video, it really would mean a lot to me if you left a like on it. But with the spiel out of the way, with all of the preamble done, let's jump right into the video. Like I said before, the first thing we are going to be starting off with in today's video is my awards. And of course, that means starting with the major awards. And there's no award more major in any of the leagues than MVP, Most Valuable Player. The player that I think added the most amount of value to their team. The player that I think was the most important towards their team's success. And I think this one's a pretty obvious one. I'm going to, shockingly enough, agree with the LCK in this one, because my MVP pick for Spring 2024 is going to be Chovy, the mid laner for Gen.G. This is just not a difficult decision in any sort of capacity for me. Chovy has been clearly the best player in the LCK, and honestly, this is a hill that I was willing to die on in the offseason. I got a lot more hate than I thought I was going to get in my offseason videos when I did my grades, giving Chovy an A+ grade, saying that he was the most valuable individual player in the LCK. I was really shocked at how many people thought that that was an absurd thing to say, even if they didn't agree. You know, I can understand wanting to put someone like Faker higher. I could understand, you know, maybe wanting to put someone like Carrier higher. Like, these players are very valuable in their own right, but Chovy, at the very least, is in the conversation. But, you know, a lot of people were talking about his international record and his lack of consistency. Say what you will, but this guy just wins at the LCK level. He has won almost every year of his entire career, especially since coming over here to Gen.G, and there's really no argument here. He was the best player in the LCK in 2024. I just don't even think there is a second option here. There are honorable mentions on the screen. We will get to them in a second, but 9 player of the series for me, 13 player of the games given out by broadcast. That's ridiculous. Might I remind you, there are only 18 series that these teams play across the whole year, and Chovy in 9 of those was the best player on the Rift. That's ridiculous. 50% of the time that he played a game, he was the single best player in that game. There is just no one else in the LCK that can even come close to that level of dominance. The last time I saw a split like this domestically was Knight over in the LPL in 2022, And even then, I was so into Knight and I was so high on him in comparison to, I think, a lot of other analysts who talked about how he was more of a selfish player. I think it's a similar story with Chovy, but it's just not the case. If you watch Gen.G this year, he is very proactive. He is very willing to play things like Talia, move around the map, create opportunities, shove and roam, play for his, jungle, play for his top lane. He is more than willing to give up resources if he needs to and be a late game carry. But of course, he's still Chovy. He can still beat you by 50 CS while he's roaming and then take over in team fights. He can do it all. He's just a very complete player. He doesn't really have a flaw, and mechanically speaking, he's probably the best player in the world. Yeah, that to me is an A+ player. That's an S caliber player in terms of the value he offers, and he really backed that up so far in 2024. The honorable mentions for me when it comes to MVP, the runner-up is going to go to Faker. Ironically enough, we'll talk about this, but all three of my honorable mentions are mid laners. I think mid lane was by far the strongest position in the LCK. What a shock. It's almost like that's how it's been almost every year, but Faker was excellent for T1. When you talk about a player that really pushed his team forward, it felt like Faker was the driving force for a lot of what T1 was doing, especially in the middle part of the split. Things didn't exactly go their way down the stretch of the split because they lost to Hanwha Life. They really, kind of fumbled some stuff at the end of the split as well, but, at the end of the day, like, Faker was really good, and taking away some of the points for the loss, I think is fair, but not enough to move him out of second place. I think that's a relatively fair thing to say. And then Zeka is actually going to get my other honorable mention. He's going to get third in my MVP voting. I think Zeka was terrific. I think a lot of people are going to want to see Viper here if we see any Hanwha Life representative, but I think Zeka actively won more games for HLE this year than Viper did. I know that might be a little bit of a controversial take. We'll talk about why that doesn't necessarily matter as we get into the all-pro teams. They were both excellent, and Viper would have come in number 4 on this list, but I really do think that Zeka is one of the best players in the league right now, and just like what was happening in 2022 for DRX, he is adding a lot more value than I think is being presented by most of the community. I don't really understand why most of the community is low on him in comparison to me, but I got to try to course correct that somehow, so he is going to be third in my MVP voting. But again, this was not a close race for me. Chovy did kind of run away with this award. But that's going to be MVP. The other major award, of course, that we have to talk about is going to be Rookie of the Split. This one is also kind of interesting, but only because there really was no clear winner. There was no rookie that was a huge standout in terms of the spring split here in 2024. Hopefully things change on that moving into summer, but my choice for the spring split, Rookie of the Split in 2024 is going to be Perfect, the top laner for KT Rolster. Me giving this to Perfect should exemplify why I don't think there was a great selection here. It really was between Perfect and Bull, depending on how you wanted to do it. Bull got more Player of the Series awards for me, but I think his bad games were significantly worse than Perfect's, and I think Perfect as a player got better as the split went along, which I think is more in line with the idea of what Rookie of the Split is supposed to encapsulate, the player that we think is going to project best into the future. Now, do I think Perfect was guaranteed the best Rookie of this split? No, because, Bull was really good, but I really do believe it came down to those two. You'll notice there is a third honorable mention. Lucid definitely deserves an honorable mention because he played so many games and he was valuable at times, but anybody who follows the channel knows I'm really not that high on how Lucid has been playing in the LCK, so we'll get to it. When we talk about Perfect, he was mostly weak side for KT Rolster. The team played so much around jungle and bot lane that there really wasn't a lot of resources to be allocated in the top lane, but he actually won lane pretty consistently. His laning stats are actually very good considering he's a rookie. We knew that was going to be a positive for him. He was really good at that in the Challengers League, and so not shocking to see that kind of translate, but a lot of Cassante, a lot of Udyr. That's kind of the style that they want him to play. He can be aggressive, he can go in and make plays and, try to initiate things, but he's really not going to be the primary focal point for a lot of the resources that are going around the map for KT, and I think that was obvious. Either way, I still think he was the most consistent rookie of the split, and Bull is kind of the second honorable mention here, like the second place, if you will. I think Bull obviously had a bigger impact in terms of what he was able to do in a positive way. When he came in for KDF, it was instant how much better that team got with him in the lineup versus with Taiyun in the lineup, and it was palpable just how much he was able to increase the ceiling of that team, but it really didn't last. He really started to trail off as things continued to go onwards throughout the split. He obviously started to course correct in the final week when KDF actually was starting to play a bit better and a bit more cohesive, but you're talking about a 3 to 4 week stretch where he was one of the worst AD carries in the league. That's not Rookie of the Split. Perfect didn't have that stretch where he was bad, so even if Bull's even if Bull's highs are better, his lows are a lot lower, and I'll take that in terms of second place. But Lucid's gonna get another honorable mention. Perhaps people are going to want to see him higher. Some people might even give him this award award just because he was in the highest profile role of any of these players. He was very influential towards what DK was doing, but for the most part, I actually saw that as a bit of a negative for DK overall. I don't think Lucid had a very good split. I think a lot of the hype surrounding him was justified. I really liked his Challengers League tape, but translating that to the LCK is a different story. There were just a lot of games where he got outpaced in the early game. He's really not that great on facilitators. He's a lot more comfortable when he is getting the resources and when he is carrying, and oftentimes that's just not the direction that DK wanted to head in with what they wanted to do. And so, you know, he kind of felt lost. I think a lot of the blame for bad macro sometimes gets thrown on Kellen because people love to hate on Kellen in terms of the DK support, but I think Lucid was significantly more of a problem for DK over the course of this year than Kellen was. And, you know, even saying that, he still was more valuable than a lot of the other rookies, which is why he gets third place. I just don't think there were a lot of good rookies in the LCK this split, but Perfect, Bull, I think one of those two should win. I'm going to give it to Perfect for stability, but those are the major awards. It's time to move on now to the All-Pro selections. But with that segue, it's time to move on to my All-Pro selections. Obviously, if you are new here, what I do for All-Pro might be a little bit different than if you had just gotten used to the traditional LCK All-Pros. LCK is pretty notorious on broadcast for having interesting All-Pro selections, mostly almost entirely based off of team standings rather than individual player performances. If you play for the best team, you're probably going to get first or second All-Pro. If you play for the second best team, you're probably going to get first, second, or third All-Pro. And if you play for a bottom, 4 or 5 team, you're just not going to get in the All-Pros no matter how good you are. It doesn't really matter your actual individual performance. It's all more about the actual team collection as a whole. I want to actively make the All-Pros more of an individual award. If you want team awards, look at the standings. You can see which teams were better. You don't need awards to tell you which teams were better, but I do think some players are more valuable than others, even if they may not be on the best teams. And inversely, I think that there are some players on the best teams that maybe haven't had as many grandiose, valuable plays over the course of this split. Not everybody's going to get a piece of the pie, and so I am going to have a little bit of a different All-Pro than the actual LCK broadcast, but I imagine that's why a lot of people click on videos like this anyway. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Of course, we're going to be starting with my first team All-Pro, and it's up on the screen now. You can see my first team All-Pro with 3 teams represented, already way more, I believe, than the actual LCK. I think there's only 2 in the actual LCK, but my first team All-Pros you can see on the screen. In the top lane, it's Zeus from T1. In the jungle, it's Canyon from Gen.G. In the mid lane, it's Chovy from Gen.G. In the bot lane, Viper from Hanwha Life Esports, and in the support position, Keria from T1. This is, in my approximation, the best player in each role. We talked about how Chovy was the best mid laner. I'm not going to go super in-depth on why, again, because we already went over him in the MVP section. He has been the best player in the league. He's been the most valuable player on the best team in the league. It is really hard to kind of look at him in any other light, but let's talk about everybody else. We'll start with this teammate in Canyon, who's in the jungle. I think this might be Canyon's best split since 2021, and that is a really, really big thing to say. I think, honestly, we were getting concerned that the downward trajectory that he was showing on DK after so many years of being dominant as a Damwon jungler, is, him and Showmaker, they're legendary. They're arguably the most consistent jungle mid duo in the history of the league in terms of their peak. It just hadn't been that way in the last couple of years. 2022, people were really low on him. I was higher on him coming out of the regular season, and he lived up to that at Worlds. Last year, I was very low on him, and or at least lower than your average analyst, and he lived up to that at Worlds as well. He was not particularly great at Worlds last year. It didn't fill me with a ton of confidence that he was going to come into this year as the new jungler for this Gen.G super team and have all this responsibility and immediately be able to pick it up, but he has been sensational, especially down the stretch. It took him a bit of time to really get rolling. It's not like he was bad in the beginning part of this split, but in comparison to maybe some of his contemporaries in the position, he didn't exactly start as the best jungler, but over the last, especially second half of the split, it's just not even been a conversation. Canyon has been by far the most valuable jungler in the league, which is why this was not really a conversation. They are the 2 players from Gen.G to get on the first team All-Pro, and I think both of them have more than earned it. And then you've got 2 players representing T1 as well. Zeus in the top lane. I think he is pretty clearly the most valuable top laner to me. Whether you want to take him or the player I have on second team, I do think is at the very least a debate, but it's a top 2 in terms of top laners in the LCK, and then kind of everyone else after that. We'll talk about third team when we get there, but Zeus was excellent. I was a little bit more critical of him going into the year because his consistency hadn't always been great, and his consistency still wasn't perfect this split. It's not like he was amazing every single game, but in comparison to maybe some of the years he's had previous, his bad games I think were better, which I think is a generally good sign. You don't necessarily need to have better great games. He's always had phenomenal great games. It's just about making sure to limit how bad those bad games are affecting your team. I think generally he was better on tanks over the course of this year. That's something he's clearly worked a lot on. And I think he's also out of his own head. It's very well documented that he took a lot of the criticism that he got when T1 would lose these major, international finals to heart, or not lose or not win the LCK finals. Like, he took a lot of that personally, and I think finally winning Worlds last year, kind of getting over the hump, really proving that he can win at the top level, I think that was something that really helped him start to unlock his playstyle a bit more. So for me, he is pretty clearly first team All-Pro, and then Keria, the other T1 player. Support is loaded in the LCK. The top 3 supports are incredibly good, and I think this is really up for debate, like whatever order you want to put these 3 in, but Keria to me was just the most innovative and I think the most explosive in terms of the 3, and so I'm going to give him the first team All-Pro nod. Again, I think you could give this to the other 2 that we're going to talk about in my second and third team, but Keria was excellent across this year. I mean, obviously he innovated the meta. He's the one who brought in the marksman. I mean, I was going to say essentially brought in the marksman. No, he's the one who brought marksman support into pro. He kind of created that last year, and he's still the best at it in the entire league. But don't be fooled, he's not just a gimmick. He doesn't just play these marksman supports. He's very good on Nautilus. He's one of the best Alistairs in the league. He can play anything. Like, you need him to engage, you need him to be an enchanter. He can do that at a high level. He's just one of the best players in the entire world. And while he didn't always prove it this year, for the most part, he absolutely did. And then Viper, going to be the only member of Hanwha Life or any team not named Gen.G or T1 to make my first team All-Pro. It's just pretty clear to me that Viper was the best AD carry in the LCK. This is what I'm talking about. Zeka, I think, was more valuable to Hanwha Life, but Viper plays a significantly less stacked and loaded position, and so Viper ends up a lot higher in terms of the All-Pro rankings, but I still think Viper was a top 4 player in the LCK this split. Certainly not bad at all. He really did step up in terms of his consistency. He's never really been a player that you're going to get bad performances out of. He's always been relatively consistent, but I think especially with a support that he can really trust, and with the mid laner that is constantly establishing pressure, a jungler who knows exactly how to prioritize whichever lane he thinks is going to win, all of a sudden the pieces around Viper become significantly better to allow him to actually start playing at the potential we know he can play at. This guy's won Worlds before. We know what he can do. It's just really nice to see him actually show it in a performance like this. So that's my first team All-Pro. It's time to move on to my second team All-Pro, and that's going to be up on the screen now as well. This one is definitely a little bit different, but still not entirely shocking. I don't think any of these are going to be entirely surprising. Maybe one of the selections on third team, but for second team, my selections are Keen from Gen.G in the top lane, Pioshik from KT Rolster in the jungle, Faker from T1 in the mid lane, Gumayushi from T1 in the bot lane, and Lehens from Gen.G in support. Again, we'll stick with teammates first and foremost, starting with Gen.G, our champions of the regular season. We're going to start with Keen in the top lane. If you wanted to put Keen first team All-Pro, I do kind of understand that. Again, I think Zeus was more valuable to his team overall. I think T1 played more often through Zeus, but the value of Keen being a strong weak side player for Gen.G has been incredibly high over the course of this year. Not a lot of people thought that Keen was going to come in and take more of a backseat. In fact, the conversation surrounding Gen.G and whether or not they would succeed or fail going into this year was, do we think that anybody on this team is going to be better without resources? Because all of them had kind of been resource heavy carries, and turns out Keen is very good on weak side when you give him a tank and just let him 1v1. He wins a lot of those matchups a lot more than you'd expect. Again, I think T1 played through Zeus a lot more, which is why I gave him the first team All-Pro nod, but him and Keen were very close in terms of my grading metrics, and if you wanted to switch them around, I think that's relatively fair. And then Lehens, the other Gen.G player that's going to be making second team here. Again, if you wanted to put Lehens first team, I think that's fair. I got another bit of criticism for saying that Lehens was better than Delight going into the year. He's the reigning MVP. I mean, not, I guess, anymore now that we have Chovy as our MVP of the split, but Lehens was so excellent last year, and, he fits really well on this team. I think him and Pace have a very interesting dynamic. Lehens much more of the aggressor, somebody who's going to be moving around the map, sometimes leaving his AD carry out to dry a little bit because he is out there making plays, but for the most part, that's going to help Gen.G as a whole, and the reason it works is because Pace is so good on weak side. We'll talk about that when we get to the third team, but Lehens is just so excellent as a playmaker. He is the most explosive support in the entire region, whereas Keria is definitely the kind of player that you can rely on to be very good in almost any situation. I think if you're looking for the best possible games, like Lehens had the best support games, like just individual games of anybody in the LCK, and he's always going to output that. He has always been more of a feast or famine support. It's just that the bad games are significantly less common now than they were 3 or so years ago. He's really evolved into one of the most complete players in the entire world, and I think he showed that off again. But the T1 players to talk about, Faker, Gumayushi. Faker, we've already talked about a bit. He was my runner-up to MVP. Super great year, just wasn't quite enough to eclipse Chovy, who I think was more valuable on a better team, but Faker still was the heart heartbeat of T1. He was the best player on arguably the second best team in the league, pretty inarguably the second best team in the league, and you just have to be excited about the fact that Faker has been able to continue that success from 2023 over here in 2024. But Gumayusi going to be joining him. Again, this is more so AD carry not exactly being super strong. I don't think Guma like blew the doors off in this season. I don't think he necessarily was dominant, but man, again, his good games were so good, and honestly, he stepped up in terms of his consistency. The bad games just don't exist with Guma, and if you're starting to notice a trend in terms of how I like to prioritize players, it's I don't really like when players are feast or famine. I don't really like when you have to like guess as to whether or not a player is going to do well or not do well in that particular game. I value not like consistency. I value the ability to go out there and give a good performance no matter what the rest of the team is looking like, and Guma offers that in spades. In fact, oftentimes when T1 is kind of falling apart on other sides of the map, when Owner is having a bad game, when Carry is getting caught out more than expected, when Zeus isn't exactly dominating the top lane, it's Gumayusi who's keeping them in those games, and so that's enough value for me to give him second team All-Pro. I do think there were other options for this. We'll talk about that when we get to third team, but I settled on him for second team. And then the lone man out, KT Rolster's Pioshik. I know this is going to be relatively controversial. He barely got any votes in terms of All-Pro from anybody on the LCK broadcast, and I honestly think that's a bit disrespectful. This is kind of the opposite of everything I've been talking about. We talk about Gumayusi being super consistent, Keen being super consistent, everybody on first team being super consistent. Pioshik is about as inconsistent as you can possibly get. His good games and bad games are polar opposites. His good games are some of the best in the entire league from any player regardless of position. And man, he had a lot of good games where he actively just won KT Rolster a lot of games over the course of this split, playing alongside Deft, playing alongside Beryl. That DRX connection, that won Worlds definitely came into play, but when it went wrong, it went really, really wrong for Pioshik, which is why I think a lot of people are going to keep him off of their list. For me, I think the good did outweigh the bad for most of this year, and I think especially when you look at where KT finished in 4th place, they do not get there without Pioshik. They won, I would bet to wager like 5 or 6 of their series because of Pioshik. If they don't have him, I do think their season becomes a lot more difficult. Again, I'm trying to acknowledge that he still had a lot of bad games, but for me, at least when it comes to second team, I think the good did outweigh the bad in terms of the, feast or famine inconsistent style. But that's my second team. Time to move into my third and final team here for All-Pro. I'll also talk about a bit of the honorable mentions when we get to each position, but third team's up on the screen now. You can see most of these are pretty stock standard who you would expect after I showed my first two, except for top lane, which I definitely think is going to catch some people by surprise. My top laner is Morgan from OK Breon. My jungler is Peanut from Hanwha Life Esports. Mid laner is Zeka from Hanwha Life Esports. Bot laner is Pays from Gen.G, and then support is Delight from Hanwha Life Esports. This is, kind of just the best of the rest, right? First and second team were kind of difficult decisions, but top 3 in every role is pretty easy to decide. There are just a lot of players that are kind of separated into these top 3 categories. We will start with the shocking one because I know you guys want to hear about it first. Morgan, Lord Morgan, coming in the top lane. I truly do believe he was the 3rd most valuable top laner to his individual team, and this is what I was talking about when I talk about my personal grading criteria being more how many wins or how much value did you yourself add to your team? Like, do I think Doran or Kingin or, Perfect or one of these other players could have potentially been a little bit more consistent and maybe an easier choice for this spot, specifically Doran? I think that's possible, but how many wins did Doran add to Hanwha Life this year? Almost none. Like, they won through almost every avenue except for him throughout this year. They just didn't really invest any pressure into Doran, any resources into Doran in the top lane, and so it's really hard for me to say that he was more valuable to his team's success than Morgan was. I think Morgan was so important that if Bro didn't have him, they probably would have went winless throughout this year. He truly was that much of a factor. I'm really in on Morgan. He's kind of turning into what I thought of Dudu last year, and so, it's nice to see top laners in the LCK continuing to prove me wrong on lower tier teams. It's nice to see bounce back seasons from players that have been ridiculed and criticized in the past. I think it's really nice to see Morgan make this list, even though he is a bit of a fan favorite now, but almost the rest of this third team is populated by Hanwha Life. I think that's generally fair. Peanut, Zeka, Delight. These are all great players. Again, Zeka finished top 3 in MVP voting for me. Just the 2 players that were above him are in his position, and so he ends up getting the third team, but he is excellent. I know some people are going to look at him and say, oh, he's feast or famine. His bad games are awful. His bad games, I think, are blown way out of proportion in comparison to a lot of the other players that we've talked about, right? Zeka can be volatile in the sense that his bad games, he's a little bit more of a non-factor, and this team does play through him a ton, but he doesn't lose lose. Like, he really doesn't lose all that often. He really isn't like down CS, down gold, down resources, down damage. He's usually relevant in some way, shape, or form. Is he better on certain champions? Absolutely. But is his champion pool a lot bigger, a lot wider than Reddit would lead you to believe? Absolutely as well. Both of those things absolutely can be true. So, you know, Zeka was an easy choice for one of the all-pro teams for me. Honorable mention, by the way, to Showmaker. It feels really bad to leave him off this list. He was so important to what DK did, and you'll notice no Damwon players, no Dplus Kia players on the all-pro lists. I think that's deserved. I think Showmaker was probably the closest player. He was the best player, but again, his position is too stacked. He would have been a shoo-in in most years, just not this year because the top three were just kind of locked in from the start. But Zeka's jungler, Peanut, is also going to be here. Perhaps you could put Peanut above Piojic, because again, if you do value that consistency, that game-to-game a bit more, maybe Peanut could be higher. But Peanut actually had more bad games than maybe people are giving him credit for. It's just the good games were so good. He's the best facilitative jungler in the world. I really don't even think that's all that controversial. He's been that for like 3 or 4 years in a row now, and he's really brought that to Hanwha life. He's allowed players like Zeka and Viper the opportunity to carry games in ways that they didn't have the opportunity to do last year with a less consistent jungler. He's just added a new dynamic to a team that has desperately needed it. And then for Delight, this is again an easy decision. The top 3 supports are all phenomenal. Keria, Lehen's, Delight. It really isn't about, you know, who's going to make the all-pro team in terms of support. It's about what order are you going to put these 3 in. To me, Delight clearly comes in at number 3, whether you want to put Lehen's at 1 and Keria at 2, or Keria at 1 and Lehen's at 2, I think is more of a question, but Delight was still excellent. I think Viper took a lot of the headlines because he was a great carry, but Delight had to set him up, and honestly, those two have great chemistry down in the bot lane. He is an asset to this team, and clearly one of the best supports in the world. And then finally, Pays, also from Gen.G. That means all 5 members of Gen.G do get on the all-pro team somewhere, which is obviously deserved with them being the best team in the league. They're the only team to have all 5 of their members in an all-pro side, but, you know, Pays I don't think was as much of a star this split as he was last split. A lot of that has to do with opportunity. Again, he was weak side for a lot of this year because Canyon and Chovy were really the focal points for what Gen.G wanted to do down the stretch, and even in his own lane, Lehen's was getting a lot more of the spotlight, but Pays was still very good, and when he was asked to be a primary option for this team, he still stepped up and did it at a super high level. There just aren't a lot of players in the league that can oscillate between being low resource and high resource at such an efficient level. And for somebody who's 17, 18 years old, it's just ridiculous for him to be as good as he is and so versatile. He's amazingly valuable to Gen.G. I just don't think this was necessarily the split for him to be considered the star of the team. Resources went elsewhere, and his ranking kind of represents that accordingly. But those are my all-pro teams. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments. I know these are always at least a little bit controversial. Not everybody is going to share my opinion, and so I would love to hear yours, of course, in a civilized, at least relatively polite manner. You're absolutely allowed to disagree with me, but maybe don't say that my opinions are invalid or that I clearly didn't watch the games. I don't think that really helps anybody, but I would love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions down below. But with all of that out of the way, that's the awards for the regular season. We can get that out behind us. We can move on now to the actual playoff analysis, and that's going to be starting with our 2 teams with a bye. But now we're moving on into our team analysis. It's playoff time, and so we're done with the regular season. We're done talking about it. It's time to talk a bit about what I expect from these teams in the playoffs. Of course, not every team plays in round 1, so we can't do a matchup analysis for every single team. We're going to be kicking it off with talking about our top 2 seeds who do get a bye in round number 1. And of course, if we're talking about the top 2 seeds, we got to start with the number 1 seed, the number 1 team in the regular season, the 17-1 Gen.G. They really have been dominant across this entire year. Again, like I said, in the All-Pro segment, they are the only team to have all 5 of their members make the All-Pro teams in some way, shape, or form, with the MVP as well in the mid lane, and you can tell why from the stats. Obviously, there are going to be some that are inflated because this team is very good, but also these stats are why this team is very good. It's because they do all of the objectives and all of the game mechanics very well. Like, really, there's no weakness on this team other than the fact that maybe they're a bit slower than some of the other teams, but we'll talk about that as we get into it. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Keen in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Pays at AD carry, and Lehen's at support. Where is the weakness? Like, where is the flaw that you attack on this team? Because I don't know what it is. All of these players are incredibly good and incredibly consistent, and all of them can carry. Like, if you want to, you know, attack a certain player on the enemy team, like, all of these players can be the one that they end up playing through and can be the highest resource player in the game, which is scary to have to try and go into. And it's a large task for anybody to have to try and undertake, but, you know, someone's going to have to do it unless Gen.G is just going to waltz into the finals. Let's go player by player, talking about the things they do right. Obviously, I'm going to spend a little bit less time on Gen.G because we've already talked about everybody on this team individually, but Keen, known more for his carry prowess for his long time on, you know, the Freecs, whether it was Africa or the Kwangdong Freecs. He was in that organization for forever as the primary win condition for them for years. He got them to Worlds. He got them to the quarterfinals in 2018. Not really much success outside of that, but domestically, he had been dominating, especially individually, for many years. He finally gets the opportunity to move to a genuinely good team here in Gen.G, you know, a super team, if you will, and he's been the one who's taken the biggest backseat approach. He has been kind of the resource-less player. I wouldn't say maybe the biggest backseat approach, because Pays, I think, definitely falls into that category as well, but Keen has been weak side for this team. He's played a lot of tanks, has not received a lot of resources, and honestly, he's super duper good in that role. As somebody who can just isolate in the top lane, give, you know, basically no resources to, and ask to win 1v1 while the enemy jungler has to deal with everything you're doing across the rest of the map. Yeah, Keen's pretty good in that role because individually there just aren't a lot of players that can go toe-to-toe with him. And so actually isolating him has led to a better year this year than he had last year, in my opinion, which I think is really big. A lot of Cassante, a lot of Udyr, they've been willing to pull out the Twisted Fate, which it'll be interesting to see if they continue on with that as we move forward. But, you know, I think for the most part, we're going to be seeing a lot of tanks on the top side, and that works for me. Canyon and Chovy, we went to lengths about. They are the centralizing focus of this team. Canyon has been a lot more on carries and playmakers in recent weeks than he had been in any previous years on DK, at least in recent memory. It's less Sejuani, even though he's still playing it a lot, and more Lee Sin, and that's what you want to see out of Canyon. Give him something that can be super aggressive in the early game, that can allow him to dictate the tempo, and not really rely on the rest of his team to capitalize. Not that the rest of this team is bad, but just giving Canyon something he can actually be comfortable on and can play that more aggressive style on. It's really what's re-unlocked him as the Canyon of old this split. Chovy can play anything. Like, there's really no scouting report you can have on him. He can play, you know, late game hyper carries like Corki and Azir if Azir is ever not disabled. He can play roamers. He can play, you know, more supportive mids like the Taliyah as we've seen, and he can do everything in between. He can play Ahri, you know, he can play everything. There's really no weakness in his game in terms of trying to take him away from certain play styles. I think the only thing that could be a concern is that in the past, in high pressure situations, Chovy has at times defaulted to his most natural play style, which is farm up for late game. And sometimes that can be a bit of a problem because, as we've talked about, the problem isn't necessarily that Chovy is too addicted to farming. It's that oftentimes I think he can get in these situations where he feels like he is the only way his team can win the game, and he needs to get as many resources as possible in order to make that happen, which leads to him being in side lanes for too long, missing too many fights, and never really hitting the power spikes instead of just taking, you know, a 40-60 play, you know, to try and get himself back into the game. And so hopefully he has evolved beyond that because it was something he had gotten better at in the regular season. Time will tell as to whether or not that's going to stay in high pressure situations, but this guy is a multiple time LCK champion. I imagine he's still going to be a major threat in the playoffs. He's better than everybody he's run into this year. And then Pays and Lehens as a bot lane. Can you make the argument they're the best bot lane in the LCK? Absolutely. I think them and obviously T1 and HLE, they are your three options. I think all of them are good options. They are clearly the three best bot lanes in the LCK in terms of consistency. KT Rolster kind of a distant fourth because Deft has been really good, but, you know, Pays has been weak side for most of this year. We talk about how Lehens is moving around the map, being super proactive, and really being a big playmaker, you know, linking up with Canyon and really being a nuisance in terms of creating opportunities in the mid game and skirmishing around objectives and things like that. Pays has obviously lost a lot of resources because of that, but Pays is so good on his own in the bot lane. Like 1v2, I don't know if I'd rather have any other AD carry in the world. There's certainly no other AD carry that gets as many 1v2 reps as Pays does. Maybe Gumayushi, you know, on T1, but it's close. Like, Pays has been awesome in the role that he has been asked to play. Even if he hasn't necessarily been a resource carry, he's not like actively winning games for this team in terms of his, you know, damage in the late game or taking over on hyperscaling champions. Just give him Aphelios, give him Varus, let him sit in lane, let him scale up, and let him be a problem in team fights. It's what Pays was really good at in his MVP year last year. He just now doesn't have to do it. He can just be that secondary carry. He can be that, you know, other piece for this team in case things don't go well in terms of their early game aggression. I think if you're talking about weaknesses, obviously, it's none of these players. Like, maybe, you know, Canyon and Lehens can get caught out a little bit too much. Maybe you're talking about over-aggression when it comes to some of them, but for the most part, they've actually toned that down this year. I think from a playstyle perspective, they are a bit slow. Like, that's really the only thing that you would say. Their early games are not nearly as explosive as other top teams in the world, specifically teams like Bilibili and JD Gaming that I think they are most often getting compared to in terms of talent level. They are going to be significantly less active in the early game, but that's because their mid games are better than both of those teams, and their team fighting is better than both of those teams. And And so could teams, maybe take advantage of some of the less than active moments they have in the early parts of games? I think that's definitely possible, but it's so hard to take advantage of a team that you just can't outskill 1v1 in lane. Like, that's the problem. In order to generate advantages, you need to find clever ways to out macro Gen.G, and that's just not going to be easy. This team is super consistent. They have a super clear play style, and their mechanics back it up. They absolutely are going to be the favorites for a lot of people going into the playoffs, and rightfully so. And then the other top seed here, the other team with a bye in round number 1 is, of course, the number 2 seed, and that is going to be the 15-3 T1 squad here. They are obviously deserving of this spot, but this has not been the impenetrable team that T1 has become accustomed to fielding going into the playoffs. Of course, them and Gen.G have been fighting it out for years at the top of the standings as the two teams to really dominate the LCK, but this year, it really felt more like Gen.G at the top 1 and T1 really seeing if they can, kind of match that kind of prowess over the course of the split. They lost to Gen.G both times in the regular season. Whether or not that will continue in the playoffs is certainly up for debate, but this team definitely has enough firepower. I mean, they won Worlds last year with the same exact 5-man roster. They definitely have enough firepower to win the LCK. It's just kind of been a bit of a problem for them to be able to do that. They've lost 3 straight LCK finals leading into this point, and they're definitely going to need to overcome some demons if they want to break that streak. But let's go ahead and go over why I think it could definitely be possible for T1 here. Their roster is looking like Zeus in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Keria at support. Everybody here in either the first or second team All-Pro, with the exception of Owner, who of course missed my All-Pro teams entirely, and unfortunately that was almost entirely justified. I've really not been impressed with how Owner played over the course of this year. I don't think there's an argument to be made that he was a top 3 jungler in the LCK in the regular season. I know, broadcast I think gave him second team All-Pro because he plays for T1, and that team was good, but he's just not an all-pro caliber jungler right now. He is not doing a lot of the things that junglers need to do in order to be proactively great. He is inconsistently very good, and he ended the split on a really high note, which I do think is at least an encouraging sign that potentially going into playoffs, there could be a lot more to get from Owner, but I'm really not excited about his lack of aggression in the early game. We talk about this a lot for junglers specifically, but early game is so important. Being able to snowball the game out of control, that is like the bread and butter of how to play jungle in 2024. The way the current meta is, and the way it has been the last couple of years, is making sure that you can get your laners ahead and then just trying to finish the game as quickly as possible, not letting it go longer than 30 minutes. That's the dream if you are a jungler, and, for the most part, T1 does a very good job of closing games out fast. They have the lowest game duration of any team in the entire league because they do, end it off one team fight. It's almost notorious how, okay, T1's kind of even, they're up a little bit but not dominating, and then one team fight happens and the game is all of a sudden over. It's kind of infamous for them, but it's not really due to the early game pressure that they apply. They're really not one of the fastest teams in the entire world. They are just kind of good, and I think their consistency in team fights is great, but Owner is going to need to step up and actually be elite in the early game if this team wants to have any chance of winning the LCK, in my opinion. Even a team like Hanwha Life, I think, has the potential to break them down early in games if they are able to generate enough pressure. So Owner's really the player I'm watching, but we've already talked a lot about the rest of these players. We'll talk about it very briefly. Zeus has been awesome this year. Maybe not perfect. Again, he's never going to be perfect across an entire split. It's just not the style that he plays, but he has been a lot more versatile. Tanks, I think, have been a bigger option for T1 over the course of this split, which is generally great, and he's also phenomenal inside lanes. Obviously, a team fight presence, one of the best team fighters in the world. This team very much favors picks like Aatrox that can win lane and also be good team fight threats. Renekton is in that category. Cassante is in that category as well. And Zeus pilots those well, but really, I think if he's in bad positions, that's not great for T1. Typically, when he is behind, it's actually not great for them to be able to win the game. Faker is Faker. Like, really, what do you want me to say about him? He's so versatile. He's so consistent. He can play anything you want him to play. He makes everybody around him better. He's the primary shot caller and communicator on this team. There's just not really a lot of negatives when it comes to Faker. He makes this team better by being in the mid lane. He is the second best player in the LCK right now, only behind Chovy. And then Gumayushi and Keria, arguably the best bot lane in the LCK. I think I even might make that argument. It's between them and Viper and Delight for me. As much as I love Pays and Lehens, I don't think they're the best bot lane in terms of the isolated 2v2, just because the team doesn't really play for it. You don't really have to worry about it in terms of prep, because you're not worried about, Lucian Nami coming out and them skirmishing all the time, or Kalista Renata coming out and them really trying to force a 2v2 power spike. It's just not really how Gen.G plays, and so Guma and Keria are definitely more of that style. Of course, they can do whatever you want them to do. I love them on Senatom Kench. I think they're the best Senatom Kench in the world, but whatever you put them on, they're probably going to be just fine on it. The real only problem that this team has, or this bot lane has, is that Keria can sometimes be caught out in over-aggressive positions. That's what the best supports in the world always tend to run into at their absolute worst, is that they're trying to make too many plays and they put themselves in, situations where they can be caught out a little more often in negative spots. We talk about it a lot with a lot of supports here in the LCK, but Keria is certainly not immune to that. We've seen bad games from Keria in the past, and Gumayushi's also not this, takeover kind of AD carry. I think he's, a little bit worse than, Gala in terms of how I want to, rank him in terms of global AD carries. He can still win games for you. If you invest a lot into him, he can be a primary resource, and he really doesn't lose all that much, but he's not Ruler. He's not, Viper in terms of how he's just going to dominate mid and late game team fights and consistently win your team games in front-to-back 5v5s. It's just not the role he's ever had, and it's honestly just not the skill set that he has as a player. He's much more stable than he is a takeover threat, even if he is better than 95% of junglers in terms of smiting major objectives, specifically on Varus. I still trust this bot lane a lot, and like I said, they're arguably the best in the entire league, but this team isn't perfect. I think there is a bit of a drop-off from Gen.G to T1 in terms of known proven talent. Can this team win the LCK? Absolutely. They won Worlds for a reason. If everybody is in form, this is probably the best team in the LCK, but everybody has not been in form over the course of this split. I think owners' ability to step up and be consistent, and this team's, willingness to play more for early game, I think really are going to dictate whether or not they can overperform some of what they've done in the regular season. But if you are going to bet on anybody, T1 is a pretty good bet. But now with the two teams that are not playing in round number 1 out of the way, it's time to get into the preview for our 2 round 1 series. One of these is going on as I am recording this, and so obviously I'm going to try to get this out as quickly as possible. I'm not watching these games. I would never watch these games before I make the video. I want to try to be as impartial as possible, not that it would change my opinion too much, because the series that is happening right now is the 3-6 series between Hanwha Life Esports and the Kwangdong Freecs. This is obviously a pretty lopsided matchup on paper. I think for good reason. Hanwha Life is considered one of the best teams in the world right now. There is a big 3 in the LCK, and Hanwha Life is very much a part of that big 3, and KDF very much snuck their way into the playoffs in as dramatic of a way as possible. They almost bottled it. They were in that 6 seed for the entirety of the year. All they needed to do was not lose almost every single game down the stretch, and they almost did it. They almost lost every single one, but they actually end off the year in a really good state, winning, I think, both of their games in the final week, finishing at 7-11. Actually, I think they only won 1, but they only needed to win 1. 7 wins was enough to get them into that 6 seed. Still, though, there is a definite favorite going into this, and I'm certainly not going to buck the trend. We'll talk about what I think these teams can do to kind of secure their victory, specifically what KDF needs to do in order to pull off the upset. Lineups are looking like for Hanwha Life: Doran in the top lane, Peanut in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Viper at AD carry, and Delight at support. And then for KDF, it's Dudu in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, Bulldog in the mid lane, Bull at AD carry, and I believe it's going to be Quantum at support. I don't actually know whether it's going to be Ondol, whether it's going to be Quantum. I think Ondol has been benched for Quantum. That seems to be the decision they've made in the last week of the season. Whether or not that sticks, I don't know. This guy's only played 4 games in the LCK, and now they're going into a playoff series against some of the best players in the entire world. It would be pretty crazy for it to be Quantum, but also I don't blame them for wanting to go with Quantum, because Ondol has been a bit of a disaster for this team. So I have him listed here because he played the final week of the season, but again, I don't know who's going to be starting at support in this series. That's really the only question. In terms of the starting lineups, the only change to this graphic that you might notice is that the colors in the middle are a little bit different. Typically, it would just be split 50-50. You've got, the left side, Hanwha Life's color on the left, Kwangdong's color on the right. But I do have a little bit of a percentile graph in the middle now. The two teams' colors are going to be kind of on the screen in favor of how much I believe in them in this series. As you can see, very in favor of Hanwha Life, with that black bar going a lot farther than the white bar in this one. I really do think this is a major underdog story for KDF. If they're even able to take a game, I would be relatively surprised. Let's talk about where I think they could go right in a series like this. First of all, Cuz is a very good and experienced player. I know Peanut's obviously great on the other side of this matchup, but, it's very rare for a team at 7-11 with this much unpredictability, with a basically unknown bot lane, at least at this level, a very young mid laner, an 18-year-old mid laner, and a top laner who's never really been in a clutch situation, even if he has played for a while, to have a player like Cuz to stabilize the team. It's very important for KDF to be able to rely on him. The problem is that Cuz has been more like, some previous junglers in the LCK this year. The player I compared him to, obviously on the Rift and not off the Rift, was Clid. Throughout most of this year, just the feast or famine, up and down version of Cuz that we got was not nearly the consistent version of Cuz that we got on KT. Now, his highs have been just as high. He's had some awesome games, and I think it was enough to give a lot of people enough confidence to give him all pro votes for the broadcast. But to me, I just don't think that the game-to-game consistency was particularly encouraging for me, especially on things like the Vi that just didn't really work out, and they continuously went to it. I'm not a fan of Vi anyways, but Cuz really reinforced that opinion. I think they're going to need him to step up and honestly either match or be better than Peanut on the other side of this matchup for this team to do well. Where are the other weaknesses when it comes to HLE? Well, top lane could potentially be in KDF's favor. Doran certainly not having the series or the season of his life up until this point. He had a huge breakout for me last year. I thought it was the best year of his career in 2023, actually being a primary carry for Gen.G during a lot of that season. But he's come over here to HLE and been weak side top, and honestly not always the most consistent of the weak side tops. I think a lot of people are just going to anoint him all pro, but I really don't think he played well so far in 2024. And Dudu's not a bad player by any means. In fact, I'm really high on him. I've been high on him for the last 2 years. On the Hanwha Life team 2 years ago, and on KDF last year, he was the only piece that was working for that 10th place team in summer. He's come over this year and been fine. Certainly not a dynamic carry for this team, not nearly as much of a focal point for how the team wants to play because they have other options, but I still think he can be very good in this top lane matchup. If you're looking for a place where KDF could potentially generate their own lead, top lane is definitely where I'm looking, and then the other place is going to be mid lane. I love Zeka as much as any analyst in the entire world. In fact, I might be the highest on Zeka of any main analyst in the entire world. However, he's not always going to be perfect. There are going to be games that you can take advantage of some of his mispositioning and mistakes. Bulldog can do that. He's talented enough to be able to keep up. I don't think this is going to be in favor of KDF. I think Zeka is going to have a very good series. I think he's set up in a very good spot in terms of how these two teams end up projecting against each other to be a big positive. But if Bulldog can actually somehow outplay Zeka, take advantage of some of his mistakes, and really create leads, like there's your avenue for victory. I think Dudu, Cuz, Bulldog, they're going to be the primary focal points. There just is not a world in which this bot lane survives, in my opinion. Bull, Quantum, props to them. They've come in a really bad situation. They've, replaced a bot lane that has been so disastrous that this team would be so good without them, and they've stabilized. They've been good enough, but Viper and Delight are a little bit of a different story. You're playing one of the best AD carries in the world and one of the best supports in the world. This is just not a matchup I expect KDF to even really be able to hang in. This is going to be very bot lane favored for Hanwha Life, and, I would expect mid lane to also be favored for them, and I would expect jungle to also be favored for them. And that's not even saying that top lane, was going to lose. I don't think Doran is inherently worse than Dudu. I don't even know if it's really going to matter. Hanwha Life are big favorites in this series for a reason, and as you can see from my percentile graph, I would tend to agree with that assessment. And then the second of the round one series here to go over, it's the 4-5 matchup, which is, in my opinion, significantly more interesting to talk about. It's the 4-seeded KT Rolster taking on the 5-seeded Dplus Kia. And I'm really excited to see where these two teams end up going. I don't think you could get a more even first-round matchup, one that I think is honestly super close. You can see from the percentile graph in the middle of the screen, I have this being closer to a 50-50 than anything else. Maybe there is a slight favorite towards one team over the other, but truly, I do believe this is going to be an incredibly close series between these two teams, and it's really going to be up to which version of KT Rolster shows up. We can talk about how DK has a lot of good things going for them. I think if Showmaker pops off and is by far the better mid laner, that really puts them in a commanding position. But at the end of the day, if Pyosik, Deft, and Beryl are the three best players in this series, then they're going to win. And if Pyosik, Deft, and Beryl are awful, like they've been at points this year, then they're going to lose. That's why they split the season series against DK. I hate to just make it that simple, but it really is that simple. I'll talk about why I think there might be reason to be positive about KT in this series, but it's certainly not locked in by any means. Let's go over the rosters. KT's lineup is looking like perfect in the top lane, Pyosik in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane, Deft at AD carry, and Beryl at support. And then the DK roster is looking like Kingen in the top lane, Lucid in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, aiming at AD carry, and Kellen at support. I am higher on certain members of DK than your average analyst would be. I think I like Kellen certainly more than what public perception is at for him right now. You're constantly seeing takes about like, oh, what does Kellen have over Dplus Kia? Why is he still in the LCK? Why does he still have a roster spot? I think bottom tier teams would kill to have Kellen. Like the consistency with which this guy offers is really high. Honestly, he had some great games this split. He got 2 player of the series for me across this split, 2 dud of the series as well, but I think Kellen's one of the players that I'm higher on, and I'm a bit higher, I would say, on Showmaker. I do think he still has that X factor inside him. I still think that if you give him, big opportunities in a series like this, he can come in clutch and he can really make it work. He did it a lot towards the end of last year and really kind of got DK to Worlds last year. So there still is a lot of reason to like DK, but there's only so much I can talk about when it comes to their specific roster, because like I said earlier, it really is going to be up to KT Rolster whether or not they win or or lose this series because they are better in almost every conceivable way. We'll talk about the lane-by-lane matchups. Perfect versus Kingen, I think, is relatively a push. Perfect has higher upside in terms of what I would expect if things go entirely right, but Kingen is certainly more stable, and he's accomplished a lot more. Also, very funnily, we've got 3 members of the DRX title team on KT. We've got 1 on DK here with Kingen, so pretty fun matchup, but I wouldn't imagine top lane to really be all that consequential in this series. When you go to jungle, now this is where things really start to get interesting. I don't think Lucid's been particularly good, which is why I think we're starting to look in favor of KT Rolster, because when Pyosik wins, KT wins. It really has been that simple. If he can get the ball rolling, if he can really get his team and himself off the ground, this team just wins those games. They know how to play around Pyosik, and Pyosik is awesome from ahead. The problem is that even sometimes against the worst junglers in the league, Pyosik just sometimes doesn't play well. There really is no rhyme or reason as to when or why it happens. He just sometimes has really bad games and sometimes isn't locked in. I think the reason that I'm a little bit more comfortable talking highly about KT in a series like this is, first of all, because I don't view Lucid very well. I think Lucid was very inconsistent this year. I don't think he was particularly strong in terms of handling early game pressure from enemy junglers. I don't think this is a particularly strong matchup on paper for him, but also Pyosik is the kind of player where you can talk about him being inconsistent in the regular season. He has almost always stepped it up in the playoffs. He has almost always stepped it up when it matters more, and I do think that is going to come into play, or at least it's coming into play in my mind in this series. I think that's a big pivot point for KT, if not the biggest in the series. But then you've got BDD Showmaker. You know, last year this would have been a, marquee matchup, but I don't think either have really had the splits that they wanted to have. Showmaker was great at the start, but as this team has continued to get less consistent, Showmaker has become less of a priority. They've played more for bot lane, which I'll certainly talk about, but he's still the player that I would expect to be able to break out if this team is going to win this series. And BDD, I was really critical of like the first 2/3 of his split. I actually thought he was playing bad, not just not good. I thought he was losing consistently and not generating pressure, even against the mid laners that people wouldn't consider elite at this level. But thankfully, the final 2 weeks of the season were pretty positive for BDD overall. Some of the best games that he played, and it's a good time to get that going into playoffs. And so hopefully that ends up equalizing itself out. I still would actually favor Showmaker in terms of the mid lane matchup. I think he's the better player right now, but at least BDD is more informed now than he was a month or so ago. And then the bot lane, Deft and Beryl versus Aiming and Kellen. And I'm very up in the air on this bot lane matchup because I do certainly think that Deft is better than Aiming, or certainly more consistent than Aiming. Deft had actually a really good split. I didn't get a chance to put him in All-Pro because I really wanted to get Pays in there, but Deft was very clearly the number 4 option in terms of 80 carries in the All-Pro selections. I honestly feel bad, having to leave him off. I think he was very important to what KT wanted to do this year, especially when they were in an offensive state earlier on in the split. I thought Deft being a primary carry and being so aggressive, willing to flip games with some of his positioning was actually kind of positive. At times it was negative for KT, but for the most part, I think it was definitely something that helped this team. The problem is I think that Kellen is probably a slightly better player to Beryl at this point. Beryl's not that great. Like, I really don't know what else to say. Maybe the macro and the shot calling is just so much better than I'm envisioning it being, but Kellen is at worst a comparable shot caller in terms of how everybody has talked about these two players in recent years. Both of these two, you could argue, are the two best shot callers in terms of reputation in the LCK at the current moment, at least from players, and Kellen's mechanics are better than Beryl's. Like, say what you will about Beryl as a macro presence, but like Beryl makes a lot of mistakes when it turns like into an actual team fight, and Kellen just doesn't make those mistakes. He's not getting caught out in weird situations, at least as regularly. And so, I think this is certainly a more interesting conversation than people would want it to be, considering how much people love Beryl and hate Kellen. But generally, I would say this bot lane does slightly favor KT Rolster, if only because I think Deft is clearly the best player of these 4 in the bot lane. But Aiming's had some breakout performances. In fact, he's been very consequential to DK. In 7 of their 18 series that they played this year, Aiming was either the best or the worst player on the Rift. He either got player of the series or dud of the series. That tells me that when Aiming's on, this team wins. When he's off, they lose. And, as much as I'd like to say that's up to Aiming and his positioning and whether or not he can capitalize on things, I think it's more up to whether or not KT can actually punish some of the aggressive decisions that DK is inevitably going to be making in the bot lane. Like I said, if Aiming and Showmaker step up and they're very good, if Showmaker's the best player in this series, then DK is going to win because Pyosik will not be able to take over in that way. But if Pyosik in particular is the best player, or if Deft really goes and pops off against his former team from last year, then I do think KT should get over the hump. As you can see from my percentile graph, I do find this very, very close, but I am slightly favoring KT Rolster. But again, it's really going to be up to which version of KT shows up. All right, but that is going to do it for my preview analysis here for the playoffs. Of course, we're done with the awards. We're done with the individual series previews. It's time to get into my full bracket prediction for the LCK Spring Split playoffs here in 2024. I'm very excited. I don't want to waste too much time. Let's get into the bracket. If you are unfamiliar with the format, we're going to be going series by series, and I'm going to be giving my predicted winner all the way to the finals. I'll also be giving a game score with a one-game spread, and so, for example, we'll talk about Hanwha Life KDF first. No shocker here. I'm picking Hanwha Life to end up winning this series, and my prediction is Hanwha Life 3-0. They should be the better team. I honestly would be more surprised if they dropped a game than if they won, right? Like, that's where we're at with HLE versus KDF. They are mega favorites, and it's for a reason. My prediction is going to be HLE 3-0, and my one-game spread is going to be HLE 3-1. You know, this applies more, obviously, when you start getting into some of those middle predictions, the 3-2s, 3-1s even, to give you a better idea as to what I think is more likely, a domination or a close series. In this case, certainly I feel more confident in a domination than a close series, but my spread is HLE 3-0, HLE 3-1 in terms of the one-game spread. As you can see, HLE moving on to the bottom side of that bracket. Round 2 is a selection, and so Gen.G as the number 1 seed would get to choose which of the two teams they would want to face in round number 2, and, you know, I'm already kind of spoiling it a bit, but there is simply nobody who's going to be coming out of KTDK that I would rather, you know, not face than HLE. I would not want to face HLE if I was Gen.G, and I certainly don't think they are going to want to face HLE unless something strange happens in KTDK that completely throws me off. But talking about it now, KT Rolster, Dplus Kia, I already previewed it a bit. I very narrowly give the edge here to KT Rolster, who I do think is going to be moving on because I do trust these players in the playoffs more than I trust them in the regular season, and DK just doesn't feel like a team that is clicking at all to me right now. It feels like a first-round exit is very realistic for DK, and so KT is going to be moving on. My spread for this is going to be KT 3-2, DK 3-2. I think it's more likely that this ends up being a close series or that DK ends up winning it than that KT ends up dominating. Although if KT wins, I imagine it will be a domination because that's just the way that they play. But yeah, I really hope for a close series because I don't think we're going to be getting one in the first one of round 1. But moving on to round 2, we've got Gen.G taking on KT Rolster on the upper side of the bracket here. No brainer for me. This is Gen.G. Until proven otherwise, this is the best team in the league. However, worth noting that Gen.G had one loss in the regular season in terms of a series, and it was to KT Rolster. Right after Lunar New Year break, KT just had a very good series, a very good week, and they were able to dispatch of Gen.G. I think that of all the teams, them in form probably has the best chance of being able to beat them. Still, I think Gen.G should be favorites, so my spread's going to be Gen.G 3-1, Gen.G 3-0. I think they should absolutely be the better team, but if KT ends up taking this series because they just end up being really good on the day, if Pioshik has an absolute banger, if Deft has an absolute banger, I'm not going to be the most surprised person in the entire world. I think, again, if any team's going to consistently be able to take down Gen.G, it's only the good version of KT Rolster. On the bottom side, T1 versus Hanwha Life. This is a very interesting series. HLE actually took the most recent one in the regular season, but I've got T1 going over here. I think in the playoffs, they're going to get more consistent, and they're going to get better at closing out games. Now, the worry with T1 is that their early games aren't particularly great, and HLE is actually the kind of team that can take advantage of that. However, I'm not exactly sure if I trust Zeka enough into Faker in terms of consistency to expect them to be able to dominate a series like this. Although if Viper comes out and obliterates the T1 bot lane, I certainly think it is going to be open to the option. And Zeka can beat Faker. We saw it in the World Finals in 2022. So I have T1 3-2, but my spread is T1 3-2, HLE 3-2. I think this is closer to a 50-50 than it is to a blowout. And then the bottom, or the lower bracket, now that we have that in the top 4, KT Rolster and Hanwha Life, again, pretty easy for me in terms of talent. It should be Hanwha Life. In fact, they match up very well into a team like KT Rolster because they have their own explosive players in Zeka and Viper in particular, and Delight to an extent. I think even if KT's on their good day, like, I don't know if they necessarily match up super well. You're hoping that Pioshik can really take advantage of a player in Peanut who has been hyper consistent in terms of domestic playoffs, and you're really hoping that Deft and Barrel can create their own advantages against Viper and Delight. I just don't like the matchup very much for KT. And so I think their best chance actually to move into the top 3 or, you know, to MSI is actually beating Gen.G as opposed to beating Hanwha Life, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but I think matchup-wise, it's just how I view it. So HLE moving on, I have this HLE 3-1, HLE 3-0. I think that's more likely. And then Gen.G T1, winners finals. What did you expect? These are the two teams you would expect in this spot. And I have Gen.G going over. Right now, it just seems like they kind of own T1 in terms of their performances. It's been quite a while. I think since MSI, I don't think they've lost to T1 since MSI in terms of a series, and that's pretty good. You know, MSI was a long time ago last year, basically a full year of Gen.G beating up on T1, which is really cool to see for them, and I think their team is more equipped than ever to be able to handle that challenge. T1 could offer some interesting dilemmas here in terms of, you know, decision-making on where you want to put your resources if you're Gen.G, but they've shown in the regular season that they're actually able to deal with that really well. I have Gen.G moving on to the finals here, in T1 and Hanwha Life playing for that final MSI spot. Remember, both teams in the finals make MSI. Gen.G already qualifying here by winning the winners finals, and again, I think this is a very close series. I would actually be surprised if either of these series were blowouts, T1, HLE, in terms of if they played each other twice, but it's just hard to bet against T1, isn't it? Like, it feels like such an inevitable fated finals that I'm gonna go with it again here. Gen.G T1 just feels like how things end up in the LCK, although again, I actually don't hate HLE's matchup into T1, especially if Zeka can have a really big series. He's gonna be the pivotal focal point for what HLE wants to do. If he can really pop off, I do think that they have a chance to just beat T1 straight up, but again, same spread, T1 3-2, HLE 3-2. That's the one game spread, but I have T1 moving on. And then Gen.G T1, is this the time where T1 overcomes their demons? I don't have that here. I have Gen.G ending up winning the LCK title. I have them being LCK champions coming out of spring in terms of my predictions. And honestly, I'm not going to say I would be surprised if they lost, but this is the best Gen.G has looked in years, and they've consistently won the LCK. What's the reason to stop them from this year other than the fact that this is the best they've looked in years, and that's kind of how things go. Honestly, you know, not to brag, and honestly, the fact that I'm bringing this up is, you know, going to curse me. It's going to immediately become untrue now that I'm talking about it in a video, but historically speaking, the LCK is my most accurate region by a pretty considerable margin. They're the one with the least amount of upsets. They're the one with the most amount of predictability. Last year, I had Gen.G winning in the finals, even though everybody had T1. And the year, you know, the split before that, I also had Gen.G winning in the finals, even though everybody had T1. Both of those times I was right. We'll see if it ends up being right this time. But honestly, I feel more confident in T1 this year than I did at any point last year, which is crazy to say. But honestly, it's more the storyline. It's more the narrative surrounding everything. T1 has not been able to overcome the Giants in the finals in Gen.G. Is this the year they finally do it? I think with the world's weight off of their shoulder, perhaps that could be the case. The LCK could be the next thing, but I would predict these are the two teams going to MSI to represent the LCK, and I think Gen.G is going to be doing it as the #1 seed, but that's going to do it. Let me know if you guys agree or disagree with my bracket or my predictions or anything down in the comments section below. If you did enjoy the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK, although we are going to post about every single round of LCK action here in the playoffs, but LPL playoffs are starting up soon. We're going to have a playoff primer for them coming out tomorrow. You know, NA's already got their playoffs rolling. The LEC playoffs are right around the corner. Everybody's jumping in to playoffs at the same time this year, and of course, MSI is also right around the corner. If you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports right before one of the bigger international tournaments of the year, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.